Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Monstrous, the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's not quite the Wendigo and not quite the Skinwalker, but probably something that has caused a whole lot of confusion. And to help us straighten out all this confusion, we have brought in the one, the only Ryan Paul Tremblay, the Wendigo guy.
Hello. How goes it, Robert?
It goes well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well considering that we're getting the Arizona summers rolling around, which means super hotter than hell weather. But I'm doing pretty good.
All right. Awesome. So we are going to talk about, and it's pronounced a couple of different ways. I was looking, and matter of fact, it's spelled a couple of different ways.
Oh, yeah.
Wechuge or Wechuga.
Mm-hmm.
Wechuga or Wechuga.
Yes. Wechuga is actually how you pronounce the singular. Wechuga is how when you're talking about the plural.
Right. And I went on the Native American Legends, which is run by several Native American tribes, and they were talking about the related figures. And so the Wendigo of the Ojibwe, the Witico of the Cree, and the Chinu of the Micmac.
Yeah, you're way ahead of me. Wow.
Says the Wechuga is a kind of cannibal monster common to the northern Athabaskan mythology. In some legends, the Wechuga is purported as an ancient ice being that comes from the wilderness to prey upon humans. But in beaver mythology, it is more often said to be a person who has been possessed or overwhelmed by the power of one of the ancient spirit animals.
Yes. So in the beliefs of a Deneza, right? That's the beaver people, and their name actually means those who live amongst the beavers, okay? Because they live along the river's edge and everything. But in their belief, the giants once actually roamed the earth. They became spirit animals, and they actually became the modern day smaller version of spirit animals. So this is what they were talking about when they say it's possessed by a giant or a spirit animal. That's what the Wechuga is, yes.
That is very interesting because there is similar mythology in Slavic mythology where they talk about certain beings who, I can't even think of the name of it right off the top of my head, but they essentially, it's a small dog man werewolf type thing. But previously, once upon a time, it was a giant that had been killed, and that spirit came back as this thing. So there's this interesting link going on right there with the giants.
Well, I don't know if it's the same with that, what you're describing right now, but with the beaver tribes, really they had what was called dreamers, okay? And these were people that when they were sleeping, they could astral project in a way, okay? And so when they astral projected, they could commune with these spirits, or they could even predict the future. In fact, it's said that when the Europeans arrived in Canada, that the beaver tribes were not surprised because it had already been foretold by a dreamer.
Right. Very interesting. So, okay. So we are pretty much of the opinion, you and I, that is, that the Wechuga or the Wechuga is kind of responsible for some of the Wendigo interpretations rather
Mhm.
than the Wendigo, and also might be falling into the whole Skinwalker thing as well.
Yeah, I think that's because with the skinwalkers, people misunderstand what the Inaradushi really are. They think that it's someone that gets possessed by the animal that the skinwalker becomes, and that's not what the skinwalker is at all. In the case of the Wechuge, though, it has to do with their spirit animals, all right? And the name
Mhm.
Wechuge, it means too strong. And they don't mean physically strong in all cases. What they mean is someone who becomes too knowledgeable. And this happens when somebody communes with their spirit animal. They gain all that knowledge, they gain all the wisdom and insight of that spirit animal, and they're too strong. So they can't be fooled, they can't be deceived any longer. So in that tribe's eyes, they were too strong.
Mhm. I actually I watched something where there was I'm trying to remember the show. Anyway, it was there's a lot of these that I watched that are centered around Native American culture, and one of
Mhm.
them was a guy. He was talking about I'm getting too strong. I have to be careful that I don't get too strong
Right.
because if I get too strong, this will happen. So
Yes.
yeah, I understand what you're talking about there.
I think in a way that's an allegory for being overly confident, because overly confident can be translated to arrogance, that you know too much or you think you know more than anybody else does. So while you might view yourself as too strong, the other tribal members will be like, no, you're arrogant, you're cocky, you're a blowhard, you know too much. So
Hmm. Well, you're my guy for Native American lore, so I'm going to kind of hand it off to you a little bit, let you walk us through. If you got to walk us through Wendigo and Skinwalkers again to get us to understand what the Wechuga is, do it. So
okay,
we
so
want to walk away understanding completely what a Wechuga is.
all right. Well, there are a lot of similarities. All right. So when somebody becomes a Wechuge, all right, they do resort to cannibalism, but cannibalism isn't the original way that they become possessed by this spirit. Like I was saying, when you become too strong, and that happens by, you're communing with your spirit animal and you gain all this insight and all that, or, you turn away somebody who's hungry. If someone's starving and they walk up to you begging for food and you become that jerk and say, no, I have nothing, you have that heart of ice. You're cold hearted. So you can actually become possessed that way. Now, it's not
Mhm.
like the Wendigo, where in the Wendigo case, to become a Wendigo, you have to resort to cannibalism. Okay. With the Wechuge, though, there's different means too. So another way someone can get possessed by a Wechuge is getting your picture taken by a camera that has a flash. Okay. So that's taboo because they believe that it takes your soul, it corrupts your soul when you get your picture taken like that. Back in those days, it was also a taboo to play or listen to an instrument that had any stretched hide or pulled strings, which we would interpret as a guitar. Okay. So they couldn't listen to that. And if a tribal member listened to a guitar, that's what they called it back in the day. I'm not sure what they called it. But if they listened to that instrument or played it, that was another means of becoming a Wechuge. And that has nothing to do with the Wendigo at all. That's what really kind of baffles people, is they think it's all one and the same. It's really not.
Mhm.
But they do have ties together, because with the Wechuga, like I was telling you, they get possessed by a spirit animal. Okay. Now, say someone's spirit animal is an elk or a deer and he gets too strong. He's going to start forming the antlers and the stag like face that his spirit animal has. So this is where the misinterpretation comes, that Wendigo have the stag head. It's not the Wendigo that people are seeing when they see this thing. It's the Wechuga.
Okay, now I was going to ask you the Wechuga. What is the description of it? Because I know I've got a picture of it on the thumbnail, and I'll probably be having one in the background here. But what would you describe it as?
Well, if I had to depict it, I would say that it's more of a human animal hybrid. All right. So you go from looking human to taking on traits of, say, in this case, a deer. If your spirit animal is a deer, you're going to start growing the antlers. You're going to start growing the ears. You're going to have similar facial features. You may not be dead on for a deer, but you look pretty similar. You start growing hooves sometimes, and you just pretty much lose any trace of any humanity. So any of your personality traits that were you are replaced by the Wechuge spirit. That's a lot different from how people describe the Wendigo. A thin, pale, emaciated being with no hair on its body, chewed lips, chewed fingertips. So really, the two physically don't look alike at all.
Right. And then, of course, there's the Skinwalker, which everybody has blown completely out of proportion. I don't know why that one has like linked on with Dogman and the werewolves so much. Um, yeah, because I mean, it's correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean that's way off from
Oh, it is.
where.
It's very much are. But I think like the reason why people kind of run those two together is because it's an easy explanation for things like dogman, werewolves. In some cases, I've even heard people say that Bigfoot is a Yinaralushi.
Mhm.
And that's when I tell people, no, you got to look at how a Yinaralushi becomes a Yinaralushi. Okay. He or she would have to wear the pelt of that creature. So in order to become a dogman or a Bigfoot, they would have to kill Bigfoot or Dogman and skin it and take its hide and go through the whole ceremony of prepping its hide for that ritual.
Mhm.
And I don't know of anybody that's just walked up to a Bigfoot or Dogman and, killed it and taken its hide. But that's where a lot of the confusion comes from.
Right. Right. Um. Okay, so let me ask this: there are some modern accounts of people running into something that's fitting the description of the Wechuga, or
Mm-hmm.
what we would call, or what a lot of people mistakenly call the Wendigo, and not in those areas. We're not in the Canadian North. We're not in Michigan. We've got people, I've even got accounts from here in Arkansas of people
Mm-hmm.
having sightings, and these are people who I trust who have run into something that they've described as that before we really delved into what the Wechuga was. So
Sure.
what do you think they could possibly be running into? Are they running into the Wechuga or is it something else?
I think it's possible. I mean, a lot of people have this ill conception that, the tribes just stayed where they are. Okay. But that's not true. A lot of the tribes did migrate. Some did come from Canada, move down to the States. Now, when they did that, they're going to take their beliefs with them. They don't abandon their beliefs at Canada's doorstep and say, oh, I'm going to America. The beliefs are different. So I'm going to leave my old ways behind. Some do, not all do. So it's possible that there are, people from the Beaver tribe that came down from Canada to the US and held on to that belief. And I would think if they still believed in it, it still has power over them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, why couldn't one become a Wechuga in the United States? What's to limit that? I don't think it's like the Wendigo where it's kind of, I don't want to say closed off, but I think that's the best way to describe that. The Wendigo has to be in that icy, snowy, cold region where the belief is the strongest. I don't think the Wechuga is like that. I really don't.
What if I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here? What if these things are independent of the beliefs? What if they are independent of the Native American beliefs? It's kind of like the Christians would say, well, God exists whether I believe in him or not. So what if the
Sure.
Wendigo, what if the Wechuga, what if the Skinwalkers, all of these things exist independently of belief?
I mean, it's possible, but I mean, in the case of the Skinwalkers, though, it's got to be in that region where it's near the four sacred mountains.
Right,
That is
right.
100% vital to the Unatalushi. Without the four sacred mountains, the Unatalushi aren't Unatalushi anymore. With the Wechuga, I mean, it's not really, I don't know. I guess it could be possible. I mean, why not? Maybe it's something that's always there and it doesn't really matter if you believe in it or not, but I would think the belief would be needed, to give that power over you.
Mm-hmm.
Because they say if you don't believe in something, then it has no effect. And I
Right.
think these spirits, these entities, would be the same way.
That's possible. That's possible. But I mean, with it being, and some of the tribes depicted as an ancient animal spirit that
Hmm.
takes over something, and
Sure.
it kind of falls within the realm of what we called the stick Indians. Now
Yeah. Yeah.
the stick Indians and a couple of other things too. So the stick Indians are more of like these elves, fairies, gnomes, whatever you want to call. But what
Yep.
they do is they use the debris of the forest as their clothing or their camouflage. And
As you do.
oftentimes they will use bones as masks and things like that. So this
Hmm.
kind of falls within that. And I've often wondered about, what if this thing can at will, basically assemble itself from whatever it comes across. It finds a skull, it finds debris, and it whenever it needs to can
Mhm.
manifest itself, this spirit?
I don't know. I mean, the tribes are pretty precise about that. They say in order for one to come into existence, there has to be that taboo that's broken or the taboos. So, I mean, I think it's limited to that in that sense, where if those taboos aren't broken and you don't have a spirit animal, then, it can't really do anything to you. It can't affect you.
Mm-hmm.
Because in today's day and age, spirit animals are almost a laughable thing. People do it for fun just to see what animal they relate to the most. But with that particular tribe, those spirit animals were vital. That was what kind of made up their personality, how they behaved, how they conducted themselves. And if you didn't have a spirit animal, it was actually you were frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is 100% a key to becoming a Wechuga. If you don't have that, then you're kind of free of that transformation.
So then, what the Wechuga would appear as would depend on the spirit animal.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, there's a story of an older tribal man who he became a Wechuga. What happened though, this was nothing that he did. He didn't do anything wrong. He took meat from somebody that was outside of the tribe. Okay, which is a very rare thing for them to do, to accept any kind of meat like that. What he didn't know is that meat was infected with fly eggs. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, do you want to guess what his spirit animal was?
There is no telling. The fly.
A frog. It
Oh,
was a
frog.
frog. So when he ate this meat that was infected with the fly eggs, he started acting more and more like his spirit animal. He was jumping around like a frog. He was eating insects like a frog. He was making frog noises. And sure enough, he was becoming a Wechuga because his spirit animal was coming out of him now. It had taken over, starting to come out little by little. And, what they say about a Wechuga is you'll start acting like your spirit animal, but the final part of the transformation is when you've chewed your own lips. Right there, that's the finality. There's no going back once you've done that.
Mm-hmm. It's
Pretty
interesting that
gruesome, huh?
yeah, it really is. It's interesting that it could be these different animals, because now that has me thinking, what about these one-off sightings of things like lizard
Mm-hmm.
man, frog man, uh, goat man, different things like that? Could these simply be
Uh,
Wechugas?
they could be. And I'm so glad you opened that door because, once I started studying the Wechuga and all this stuff, I was looking at it going, well, there's a lot of animals out there, a lot of cryptids that have animal-like appearances, but they walk like men, so could it be something that segued into them being possessed and taking on their spirit animal? And I mean, I think it's something we all need to start looking into just a little bit more rather than just dismissing it as fairy tales and folklore. Maybe kind of realize there's some reality to it.
Mm-hmm. So the Wechuga really wouldn't be a cryptid. We would refer to that as an entity more than anything else, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. I mean, it falls in the category of like Wendigo, Ravenmocker, Skinwalkers. People call them cryptids, but they should not be labeling them as cryptids.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm even guilty of that because I have the cryptid field guide and I throw those into the cryptid field guide. But
For
quite
shame on
frankly,
you, Robert.
it's because I don't want to create an entity field guide too.
I mean, you could create a little subdivision, put cryptid field guide, put parentheses, and be like entity guide.
Yeah,
That's
there
what
you
I would.
go. I've actually thought about it one time, just doing a whole series of just strictly Native American ones. So, which I
Mhm.
probably will do at some point. But
That's a
anyway,
great idea.
but anyway, um, why do you think it is that the Wechuga is always depicted as the same way that they want to depict the Wendigo, with
I
the
think that,
skeletal, yeah, with the skeletal buck, and then
well,
the
that's
rotting.
social media and pop culture. They didn't know what the Wechuga was. They saw a picture of it and they were like, "Oh, Wendigo," but they didn't really look into it. And if they bothered to look into it at all, they'd be like, "Well, wait a minute, it's got a different name. It's got a different origin to it. So it's not a Wendigo." But I think also because people think the stag-headed, the furry-looking Wendigo is the cooler of the two, and maybe they're right in some way. I don't see it. I don't see the appeal. I think it's actually kind of degrading to the original folklore,
Right.
but I think it's because it looks better. It's more, shall I say, marketable.
Yeah. Which is interesting because in a lot of ways it's much less stealthy. You trying to move through the forest with those big antlers, unless you're a deer who's used to that, and even deer will run into problems. So
Hmm. I
It's
trip over my own 2 feet, so I can't imagine running around in snowy woods with antlers. I'd be stumbling all over the place.
well, the woods around here, you don't run very far because there's so many thorny vines. You just get hung up like, you're caught in some kind of
Yeah,
web or something.
that's what I'm saying is I'd probably run right into those because I wouldn't see them and just be like, oh, what a predicament. I'm stuck.
Right, right. All right, what else you got on Wechuga?
All right, so a lot of people think that they can't be killed, which physically there's very little that can harm them. Okay, but there
Mm-hmm.
is a way that the tribes used to stop them. What they would do is they would corral them into a fire so that the heat from the flames would melt the ice around the heart, and
Mm-hmm.
that was really the only way of stopping a Wechuga. Now if you look at the Wendigo, they had certain means to actually kill it, to destroy it. The Wechuga was not really killed in a way, but it was more or less like when you unfroze the heart, that spirit went away.
Okay, so I'm going to back up. How do you kill a Wendigo?
Well, you have to dig out its heart and you have to burn the heart. Just bring it down to ashes, put it in
Mm-hmm.
a silver box, and bury the ashes of that heart on hollow ground.
Aha. Okay,
So
so there is a
that's
way to get rid of your Wendigo problem.
there is, but I mean, are you going to tackle the Wendigo though? I mean, you're going to run up to it and say, "Hey, I got to dig your heart out."
Well, if you're in a situation where it's either you or the Wendigo, you may just go ahead and push that button.
You better get me an army first.
Okay, so with the Wechuga, all you have to do is melt its cold, cold heart.
Yep, yep. It's interesting, isn't it? And something that we want to note too is that the Beaver tribe and the Cree, the ones that believed in the Wendigo, they didn't really have a lot of contact in that way. Now they had contact in the sense that there was land disputes. Okay, so they were quarreling over land, and they talked about the land, but they didn't talk about their spiritual beliefs. And what I find so interesting is that two tribes that were so far apart from one another had two creatures that were so similar. Okay, so there's something to that belief. These tribes were seeing something and experiencing something that solidified the beliefs in these two creatures.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. Now, like I said, I've actually heard of some instances of creatures being spotted as a matter of fact, in Arkansas. I know of
Mm-hmm.
two accounts. Amber Vance, who is, on TikTok and she's been on here a couple of times, she actually got contacted by a couple of individuals about a year and a half ago, and
Mm-hmm.
they were hunting and they ran into something like this. They thought it was a Wendigo at the time. And then the second one that I can think of right off the top of my head, a gentleman I work with, I won't say his name. I don't know that he wants his name said,
Okay.
but they were actually doing some paranormal research and they were looking for an old graveyard that was out in the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And they were traveling down this very old road, and I believe it was at night. And he said, kind of all at once, off on the right hand side, they saw what they thought was a buck at first because they saw the antlers, kind of sticking out through the brush. And then this thing stood up and it was 7 foot tall. And,
Yikes.
it was just this, this skeletal face. And then
Oof.
he said, and that's all you could see was this, this thing off in the brush. He said they, beat feet the hell out of there.
Now,
They turned
was it
around.
was it wearing a skeletal mask or was its face just skeletal?
That part I don't know. Now the way he presented it was that it was a skull.
Okay. Okay.
So now I would probably have to dig a little bit deeper and see where he goes with it. And he may probably would simply say, "I don't know, dude. It scared the out of us, and we hauled it."
Well, who's to say there aren't variances? I mean, you don't know who has what for a spirit animal. Okay.
Mhm.
Just the same, you don't know how that spirit animal would manifest if it were to possess somebody. You can't say that there's like a template or there's a mold for them to look like with the Wechuga. So if you had a deer or an elk or something along those lines that was your spirit animal and you got possessed by that spirit animal, it could look like anything, really, I would think.
Mhm.
I mean, we don't know. We don't know what the limitations would be.
Do you think it's possible that? I mean, this is kind of a weird question to pose because neither one of these things are proven. So anyway, I'll
Mhm.
throw it out there. Do you think it's possible that maybe something like Sasquatch could be wearing something like that too?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I could see Sasquatch donning some skulls to kind of blend in a little bit more. I could
Yeah,
see that.
almost kind of like a tribal type thing,
Yeah.
as wearing it. I mean, we don't understand anything about their society or anything like that.
Well, we can throw back to a conversation that you and I had earlier, the teepee structures, the
Right.
stick structures. If they spent all this time around all these tribes, they're going to see the tribal members doing the same thing. So it could be imitation. And I'm sure, there were times that tribal members donned skulls or whatever to kind of blend into the environment when they were, at war or whatever. It's a way to stay hidden. So why wouldn't Sasquatch imitate that?
That's true. That's true. So that's always a possibility that maybe people are running into something more or less like Sasquatch who just happens to
It could be.
be carrying something like that around.
I'm kind of on the fence about the whole Wechuga in different states. I mean, it's possible because a lot of people in the states do have indigenous blood. Okay. And who's to say that their indigenous blood doesn't stem from Canada, from the Beaver tribe? Okay. So if that's in your blood, then essentially, in some ways, the Wechuga belief is also in your blood. It's part of your heritage. So why couldn't somebody in the states become one? You know what I'm saying?
That's true. That's true. I don't know that it wouldn't have the same limitations that a skinwalker would have, right?
No, I don't think so. I think because it's a spirit, it's that spirit animal that's so strong. It used to be a giant, that had so much power. I think it, has virtually no limitations, really. It could make you look however it wanted you to look. Whatever suited its purpose the best, I would think.
Do we have any descriptions of what these giants originally look like?
No, that's the interesting thing, is they really don't have any flat out depictions that say, oh, this is what they were and this is what they became. So it kind of makes you wonder, what did they look like? What were they, that mysterious? Were they that feared that they just didn't want to talk about them? Which would make a lot of sense, because they don't like to give them credit. And when they say we don't like to give them credit, it means they don't like to give them that peace of mind. They don't like to talk about them and give them the dignity of being spoken about.
Right, right. Plus, there's also, once you start speaking of them, you could incur their wrath or you could invite them in.
Oh, yeah, there's power in words. And I keep telling people this. Even Bruce Lee believed it, okay? He used to say, be careful what you say about yourself because your body starts to believe it. Now, if he believed that, then words have that much strength that if you're talking bad about some great, powerful entity, that if it ever hears it, it's going to be like, so I heard you were talking trash when it comes knocking at your door.
Yeah, really.
And I wouldn't want that. If a giant came knocking at my door, I'd be like, yeah, it totally wasn't me. That was Robert. You misunderstood.
So we're talking about the Wechuga, and what do you know of the Chinu?
Oh, the Mi'kmaq belief, huh?
Yeah.
Well, again, see, that's another thing that's very, very interesting because it's similar to the Wendigo. It's similar to the Wechuga. And again, these three tribes didn't really have a whole lot of contact. So they were seeing a very similar entity that had quite different variations amongst it. But they were seeing something that was that similar. Okay. And you have to question, well, why? If they weren't contacting each other, how is it they have so much in common? Now people can say, oh, well, people tell stories, which is true. People do tell stories, and it does go from one place to another, to another, to another, telephone, telegraph, tell a friend. But back in those days, when the beliefs were the strongest, there wasn't any telephones, there wasn't any telegraphs, there wasn't any television, so for these three tribes to have so much in common with these entities, you got to wonder, well, how did that happen?
Exactly. Yeah, if you look at again, I'm on that. If anybody ever wants to check this out, it's nativelanguages.org. And it's Chinus are evil man-eating ice giants of northern Wabanaki legends. A Chinu was once a human being who either became possessed by an evil spirit or committed a terrible crime, especially cannibalism or withholding food from a starving person.
See?
Yeah, causing his heart to turn to ice again. In a few legends, a human has been successfully rescued from the frozen heart of a Chinu by usually once a person has been transformed into a Chinu, their only escape is death.
Very, very similar to a Wendigo. Very similar to a Wendigo.
Right.
So again, I go right back to that. These things had so much in common. Then why is that?
Yeah.
They weren't sending homing pigeons saying, hey, there's this entity out here. This is what it's about. It wasn't like that, so there had to be some kind of spiritual thing that was taking place here, that these tribes were running into it.
Yeah, I mean, you can go on and on because the Micmac, the Wakan, the Anna, the Wakanashi, the Anishinaabe. Sorry if I'm saying it wrong. The Cree, the Iroquois. I mean, each one of them has their own ice giant. That
Yep. Yeah. Like, they have Ginosqua, another ice giant, which is, also a stone giant. So there's something
yeah,
going on there. And I know a lot of people will say that, well, native tribes had some really weird beliefs and, not all of them are real. And when they say that, though, I get really irritated, Robert, because I'm like, well, hold on. You Bigfoot researchers, when you want to prove that Bigfoot's out there, you try to name all these different tribes that had belief in Bigfoot. But when it comes to Wendigo,
yeah,
Wechuga, Chinu, you don't want to believe it. Why is that? That doesn't make any sense to me. That's cherry
yeah.
picking.
Yeah, the Native American culture is great to resource if they have something that supports what you believe in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but then the rest of it's just silly because it's just silly red man beliefs. If it's something that uh, you're not behind or you
Exactly.
don't support, which is really horrible of us
It
because
is. It is.
we
For me, though, that's confirmation. I don't really need to see a Wendigo or a Wechuga or a Chinu. I mean, I know they were out there. At least at one point in time, they were very abundant. They were out there. It was a reoccurring thing. The tribe said it. They talked about it in great detail. For me, that's confirmation. I don't need to have somebody walk up and be like, oh, well, here's a Wendigo corpse or here's a Chinu corpse. I don't need that. I really don't need that. That's how strong my beliefs are with the indigenous beliefs that I don't need proof. That is my proof.
Mhm. So, what else do we need to know about the Wechuga?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating topic that, people really need to start studying more. I think if they started looking into it a lot more and actually looking at the details, scratching beneath that surface, they'll see that their belief in the Wendigo was all wrong, that it was the Wechuga that's responsible for what people, depict as the Wendigo nowadays. That
Hmm.
there's a lot of differences between the two, though. There is a whole lot of differences. And I would love to see people actually learn those. I would be thrilled to see more people talking about the Wechuga on podcasts,
Yeah,
and actually saying the correct stuff and not having like military guys hunting down the Wechuga or whatever. Talk about the actual facts.
yeah. You never know. We might start a whole fad here that all over YouTube we're going to start seeing all these.
I hope so.
I
I
was,
hope.
yeah, but I'm afraid it's going to be. I was in the military and we hunted Wechugas or something like that.
Oh no, Robert, see what you did there? You put that energy out into the universe, you threw it out there, and now it's gonna happen. See, you're manifesting it, Robert. Don't do that.
Well, see what I was attempting to do was reverse manifest.
Oh,
So if I call it out now, it just flat out won't happen.
oh, so you're gonna do that whole reverse psychology thing of you should totally do that. Wink,
Yeah,
wink. You should
yeah,
totally do it. Nudge, nudge.
exactly. So Mister Ballin, if you're listening out there somewhere, don't do this.
Wow, you called somebody out by name.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
that.
Yeah, it gets kind of mean here in a while.
Mm-hmm. But
And
anyway, with the Wechuga, though, like a lot of people think that the Wechuga itself will become this giant monstrous creature, but that's not really what they say about it. It doesn't. It's not like the more it eats, the bigger it gets. Okay, that's the Wendigo. That
right.
should be separated right there. The Wendigo grows the more it eats. Okay,
Mhm.
Wechuga does not. So, in fact, in a way, I would say the Wechuga is almost the timid one out of the two. Out of the Wendigo and Wechuga, that's the more timid cousin. I think that's the one that kind of sits in the back waiting for the prime opportunities, whereas the Wendigo is always jumping at the chance.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, there are actually stories of Wechugas being helpful.
Yeah, very rarely though, very very rarely, and I think that stems from what they believe is like it depends on the person. The
Hmm.
person, if it's a strong enough person with a strong enough will, not all of it is lost during a transformation.
Hmm.
Whereas a common person who just didn't really want to do much, then that's the kind of person that gets taken over and they become the evil variants of those Wechuga. Whereas if you have that strong will, you're compassionate, and you have a very good heart, then you become that somewhat helpful Wechuga.
You would think that if you were compassionate and you had a strong enough heart, it would be almost impossible to become a Wechuga.
I think there is that internal struggle. I think that the spirit and your own essence kind of struggle for dominance. I think there is that, and I think that's why they're helpful at times because they're
Hmm.
not completely taken over. There's still that shred, that morsel of their humanity left in there.
So if I got to run into one of the three, I got to run into either, I've got three doors to choose from. Behind one's going to be a Wendigo, behind one's going to be a Skinwalker, and behind the other is going to be a Wechuga. Which one of these three do I want to pick?
None. But if you want to go with the less dangerous of the three, I'd probably go with the Skinwalker. Because he or she doesn't want to eat you, whereas the Wendigo's gonna look at you like you're a order from Wendy's. And what two guys gonna be like, oh, I'm hungry too. So I'd probably go with the Skinwalker.
All right. So if we got to pick, we're going Skinwalker all the way. All right.
Yeah.
Got that.
Okay. I
Okay.
don't want to see either one, to be honest with you. I would hope you'd say, yeah, I'm not going to open any of those doors. I'm going to walk away from this. But I guess if you had to open those doors, go with the Skinwalker one.
So you would say then, because the Wechuga is kind of confined to the north, like the Wendigo is, that chances of running into something like that down in the southern part of the United States would be pretty low.
I should think so.
Being a true Wechuga.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a true form of it, the true essence, then yeah, I'd say it was pretty rare. But I mean, I always go along that whole thing of the thought forms, that people think about it so much that they see something similar to it, and maybe that's what's going on here. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unfortunately, I have a way of communicating with a Wechuga, or maybe fortunately, I don't have a way of communing with one.
Right. So I know the other night on Midnight Lycanthropy, you, me, and Kenny kind of talked a little bit about thought forms and stuff like that. How do you really feel about that, as far as things like the dog man, the lizard man, the goat man, things like these one-off things, kind of like we talked about with the Wechuga? If we're gonna set aside the possibility of the Wechuga being to blame for something like that, how do you feel about thought forms playing a role in these entities, these ones that not only the one-offs, but the ones where things just don't seem to make sense?
Sure. Well, I mean, it would make sense. I mean, that would be a theory that kind of lends credibility to some of these encounters. Whereas the lizard man, I don't know. I think that was something that really did happen. I think there was a case where the young boy did get attacked by a lizard man on the side of the road. Where it went, I don't really know. But I think in other cases where people are seeing these, bulletproof dogmen, the invisible ones that disappear, or the Bigfoot that just cloak, I think that the thought forms a way to look into it. I think there's something that's going on with that. Because that would explain a lot. That would explain a whole lot, that these things are here for just a few minutes. The person sees them, they take a shot at them, the bullet goes right through them, and then poof, they're gone. I mean, that would actually kind of lend some weight to the whole thought form thing, that they're so obsessed with it. They're thinking about it constantly, that their mind generates a thought form that looks like a Bigfoot, looks like a dog man. And then suddenly it's gone. The energy's gone. So the entity is gone.
Right. Yeah, because there's kind of this simultaneous duplicity that happens with, we'll just say Sasquatch. We'll stick with Sasquatch, the old tried and true. So you have the flesh and blood camp, who's not wrong, but also not right. They're looking at the physical. They're strictly looking at the physical flesh and blood, which that's what I was. I was completely flesh and blood. It's biological. It leaves hair. It leaves scat. It leaves tracks. It has a physical effect on its surroundings. It can throw trees, it can throw rocks, it can build structures, it can do this. So, and it kills animals to eat them. Raids chicken coops, kills deer, kills dogs, kills other, it carries off hogs. So this is all very biologically based. And then you have these things that happen where you're out on, doing research and investigations, where you see orbs, you see flashes of light, you find tracks that disappear, a trackway that disappears, or a trackway that appears, or, you have these screams that seem to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. You have that, where everything just goes completely dead. So it's like this weird, like I said, simultaneous duplicity that's happening between something paranormal and something flesh and blood at the same time.
Sure.
So it makes you wonder what exactly the hell is going on, because we have a hard time trying to see it in both ways at the same time. Now I know the Native Americans, of course, or the First Nations, whichever you want to call it, they have a way of seeing both simultaneously at the same time.
Sure.
How can we do that? How do we grasp that?
Well, I think we lost our connection to nature. I think that's one of the things that really is preventing us from seeing the supernatural aspects because we live in the supernatural world, Robert. You
Hmm.
know, I don't mean ghosts bumping around everywhere. I don't mean all this, spooky stuff is all supernatural, but we do live in a very supernatural world. You know, the creation of life is supernatural in a sense, okay? I mean,
Hmm.
not to piss people off here, but in a way, even Jesus and God would be supernatural, okay?
Right.
So I think when we relied so much on technology, our cell phones, our tablets, those kind of things, we lost that connection to understand the supernatural. And we also lost that connection to see it. And I think some people still have that connection in a way. They're not as strong as they should be. And I think these are the people that see the disappearing Bigfoot, the bulletproof dogman, the things like that, because they still have that gift. They have that sight where they can see the supernatural part. I think that's what's happening with a lot of people. And I think that we have to start opening ourselves up to it again. Yeah, because believe it or not, back in the day, Robert, I was all flesh and blood. Okay. I believed Dogman, Bigfoot, they had to be 100% flesh and blood. There's no possibility. But I started really opening myself up and learning from different people. And they were showing me things where it's like, well, maybe they're not flesh and blood anymore. Maybe it's not all flesh and blood. Maybe there's more than one thing going on here. There could be 3 or 4 things going on at the same time. We don't know.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So if we have a researcher or investigator out there listening and they want to, they've got all this stuff that's contradicting,
Mm-hmm.
what would you recommend their first step being in trying to come to terms with this?
Well, I mean, they just at first that they have to accept that we do live in a very supernatural place. Okay,
Hmm.
we're spirits having a human experience. We're not humans having a spiritual experience. We're spirits having a human experience. So things happen around us that we just don't see because we close ourselves off. People need to stop and breathe and learn to open themselves up again so they can start accepting these things. So when they see it, they're not like, I didn't see this, I'm insane. They can see it and go, okay, something out of the ordinary happened. So I need to understand it and I need to accept it and understand that you're not crazy. You're not insane for seeing these weird things happening. That's the first step I would take.
Hmm. I think a lot of people too are afraid to open up to something like that. It's kind of, if I deny that it exists, then I won't experience it. I don't
Yeah, it's
have
that out of
to.
sight, out of mind mentality.
Yeah, yeah.
Which,
It's
maybe it's okay for them. Maybe that just helps them live a normal life. And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. But you can't always deny things when you see them. You have to stop and try to understand those things. Okay. So say you happen to see a Wechuga somewhere. Okay. You
mhm.
can't go, no, 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 I didn't see this. I didn't see this. What you need to do is you need to accept that yes, you did see something. Yes, it was not ordinary. You need to start looking into it and start accepting that there are entities out there. There are
Mhm.
spirits out there. And unfortunately, sometimes you may happen across them or they'll happen across you. And you need to understand what you're dealing with.
Mhm. That's true. This conversation really reminds me of one of our members on the group, Jim. He actually asked a really good question, and I haven't had a chance to address it. And I thought I'd mention it on here. And essentially, what he was asking is, do you think that our parents knew about these things, these monsters, other than human monsters, these other monsters, and purposefully chose to omit them from telling
Ooh.
us, or were they hiding it from themselves basically whenever they would, tell us, monsters aren't real?
Okay, so in my case, in my mother's case, I think she was hiding that in a way because she was afraid of the monsters. Whereas my
Hmm.
father, though, my dad used to talk about the Rougarou all the time. And
Hmm.
as a kid, I thought he was joking. I thought it was just something he was bringing up to scare me. It's what dads do to their sons. They try to be those little butt heads and try to freak them out. And as I got older, though, I started noticing, when he talked about it, he had a very serious demeanor to his expression. I'm going, oh, Dad, you're serious about these things. When you talk about wood boogers and Rougarou, you're not joking. So I think my father, anyway, was kind of prepping me that, he was telling me in his own way, oh, there's things out there that you don't know of, Ryan. You're going to learn of them someday.
Yeah.
Not
Now,
everybody's like that, though. So,
yeah. Well, see, my parents were never the ones to say that things don't exist. And I think
mhm.
that monsters don't exist because I think they have experienced them as well. I know my dad did whenever he was younger. He told me several stories of things that he'd run into, but
Mhm.
he would often tell me, "Be careful what you go looking for because you might
Yep.
find it."
Yep.
And now he also told me this in the hopes that it would make me feel better, but it actually had the opposite effect. He would say there's nothing there in the dark that isn't there in the light.
Nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, well, what he was trying to tell me is that there's nothing creepy in my room at night that wasn't already there in the daytime, which really had the opposite effect on me. And it just made me think, well, son of a bitch, that thing is here in the daytime and I just can't see it. Yeah.
He was trying to give you nightmares, man. That's
I,
messed up.
I think he was trying to help, but what he was trying to say is there's nothing there at night. It wasn't there in the daytime. It's not there at night. But the way my brain was working was absolutely the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Was, well, I've already seen it at night, so that means this thing's hanging around in the corner during the daytime.
It's
So,
right, right,
you know,
right. It's
but
entirely possible too.
I think we have to take into account what our parents' beliefs are too.
Absolutely.
Parenting is not the easiest thing in the whole wide world. Parents are still humans too.
Oh,
So and they have their own beliefs, and some churches and some beliefs are very. If you don't acknowledge these things, they won't bother you, and they
sure.
see everything paranormal, everything supernatural as something demonic, which it
Yes,
isn't. So um it's a tough question to answer. It's a really good question, but
that is a
man,
really good question. That's great.
it would almost take an entire book to explain that one question, I think.
Oh, maybe you should write that book, Robert.
Oh dear God, I've got a whole series of books I haven't even had a chance to start writing because I've been so
Oh,
busy with the podcast and
oh, were you
investigation.
hinting at I could write the book? Because I mean, my two write books are just the list is full, bro.
Yeah, I was going to say you and I are both busy with everything going on. You're
You
you're
sure
not.
are.
I mean, you're usually on podcasts, and I'm usually producing, making podcasts. And yeah,
Yup.
my book writing thing has kind of had to go, without being a pun, take a shelf, you know, uh, until I get a chance to really get back at it.
I
But
hear you. I hear you 100%. Like I was telling you before the show, I was up late working on the Cherokee mythology book, and man, I worked a lot later than I thought I was going to. I started in the evening. By the time I realized it was 5:30 in the morning, I'm like, oh, I stayed up really late. This probably isn't good.
hmm
So I mean,
yeah,
that's what happens though, and this stuff is so fascinating that you don't want to stop. Once you get on that roll, you're like, no, I got to keep going. I got to keep going, and
yeah.
that's what happened with me.
Yeah, and then you have to be careful too that you're not going to hit a spot where you burn out for a little bit because that can happen. You can hit a spot where you kind of burn out and you're like, "Oh,
Oh,
I need a
absolutely,
I need a
absolutely.
break from all this craziness and everything." And so, but luckily
Well,
that's not really happening yet. So,
Well, I've had some supernatural experiences that kind of made me sidestep the Wendigo book. I remember I was telling you that I was on a podcast and I was jokingly talking some trash about the Wendigo,
mhm.
and here I am in Arizona and it started snowing as I'm telling my joke, and I'm just like, well, that was snow out of nowhere. I think I'm done talking trash about the Wendigo. Great.
Mhm.
So here I am lighting the white sage and everything, and bugging William for a blessing. I'm like, yeah, I was talking crap about the Wendigo and it started snowing.
I bet he had a few words for you about that.
Like a big brother would. He's like, then
Yeah,
stop talking trash about the Wendigo, Ryan. I'm like, thanks, William. Thanks. That was really helpful, man. Yeah.
kind of figured that out already.
I mean, the minute it started snowing like that, I was like, oh, that's not natural. That's supernatural right there. So I'm going to behave now. I'll be that good little boy.
All right, so since you can talk trash and incur the wrath of the Wendigo,
Oh,
can you
great.
talk trash and incur the wrath of the Wechuga?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Given that it's attached to spirit animals, which are very much sacred in tribal beliefs, yes, if you disrespect the Wechuga, you can definitely incur its wrath. You're going to bring about its interest where it's going to take the form of your spirit animal and it's going to start paying attention and taking note of who you are and what you do. And it's going to wait for that opening for you just to slip up so that Wechuga can possess you and take hold of you.
How could somebody seriously go about finding what their spirit animal is?
That's a long process. You'd actually have to talk to a shaman or an elder and he could instruct you on how to find your spirit animal. A lot of them
Okay.
will tell you that if you go outside and you find your center, you take your shoes off, you take your socks off, put your feet deep in the grass or the dirt, and put twigs between your toes, and just find that zen, that your spirit animal will come to you.
Hmm.
And it's the animal that you see most frequently. So, like, say you're doing it for one day and you see a whole bunch of animals, those aren't your spirit animals, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing it days in a row, and you say, for example, Robert, you start doing that for numerous days back to back to back, and there's a fox that keeps coming to see you, and it's the same fox each time, that's most likely your spirit animal.
Very interesting. Very interesting. But yeah, I think I would probably want to work with someone who is more knowledgeable in that, as far as like a shaman or something like that.
Mm-hmm. That's always the wise way to go.
Yeah.
Always the wise way to go.
Yeah. Because I think a lot of people think it's kind of like finding your spirit animal is like going to the Chinese restaurant and flipping over the menu and seeing what year you were born in. And I was born the year of the dog. So, my spirit animal is,
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't work that way. And a lot of people are under the false impression, too, that you act like your spirit animal once you know what it is. That's not what spirit animals are for. Each animal represents something different. And you're supposed to learn those values, those qualities from the spirit animal. You're supposed to take its guidance and its wisdom and apply it to your own life. It doesn't mean that you, as a human being, act like that spirit animal. It means that you take the wisdom that animal offers you.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what else you got going on?
Oh, well, I'm going to be going on another show on the 16th, and then I'll also have on the 17th, the Eye of Jupiter. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to you being on there, hanging out with my buddy Tom Franklin.
It's my debut on there, so anything could happen. Anything could happen on there.
Exactly. Yeah, I've hung out with him a couple of times. I've had him on this show once. I'll probably have to bring him back over. He is a really cool dude. You'll have a lot of fun with Tom.
Oh, I'm sure I will. I love talking with people. You know me, Robert. I love just coming on the show and chewing the fat and talking about cryptids and Wendigo and Skinwalkers and giving everybody nightmares. I really got to stop doing that. I feel really bad.
I've always said I'm not really one for the typical nightmares or whatever, where people usually talk about, well, I was having this nightmare. Well, I was being chased through the woods by some kind of monster. I'm like, I usually have that dream where I'm that thing in the woods chasing people.
Well, there was one guy sometime back where he was completely new to Wendigo and Skinwalkers, and I warned him. I'm like, well, when I'm done talking to you, you're probably not going to sleep too easily. And he's like, no, I'm game. I'm tough. I'm ready for this. So I did the show, and not even 10 minutes after, he's like, all right, I'm totally having nightmares tonight, dude. Every light in my house is turned on. I got my windows bolted and my doors locked. Thanks a lot, Ryan. I was like, hey, I warned you. I warned you. What do you want?
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this puppy up, and you tell Tom I said hi. So hang around just a few minutes, and let me wrap this up, and I'll be right back.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Have a great night. I appreciate you dropping by and hanging out with us. And as always, remember, lock your doors, lock your windows, check in the closet, and check under the bed, because monsters are real, and you never know when they're going to come back. Everybody have a great night. We'll see you next time.
Whispers in the twilight.